up if you'd like to, share an opposing view. That's great. And be thoughtful about where other people are coming from and why you're coming from, why you think what you think based on where you're coming from. Review from the first week, we have a variety of social teaching documents. We have social statements, which are the full-blown things that require years of study and editing, and they have to be voted by church-wide assembly. We have, I'm not using the mic. Am I supposed to be? Yeah. Hello, maybe. Okay, I did that all the other weeks, and I guess I didn't think of it today. Okay, and then we have social messages, which are not quite as long. They can be whipped up more quickly, and they can't establish any new teaching because they don't have as much study required as part of them. So you can't just on a whim change our past teaching or come up with new teaching. But they can summarize or address pressing concerns. And then policy resolutions are much more specific, a particular social question or even like a piece of legislation that's up in Congress, we might make a social policy resolution about. So we're not going to get into social policy resolutions in this class, but we are looking at social statements and social messages. So these are the main documents that we're focusing on in this class. The first week we looked at the ELCA Constitution, and that's where we saw this idea of the separate institutions but functionally interacting, the church and the state. That is in our Constitution, and then that is referred to in our 1991 social statement, and also it comes from social statements from before the founding of the ELCA, from our predecessor Lutheran bodies. So we looked at, that's the statement from 1960-something. We looked at our very first social statement, the Church and Society, last week, and talked a little bit about the First Amendment and what it is and what it isn't, and that'll come up again today. And then the next two that we're gonna discuss today are the most recent social message that was passed in 2020, and the social statement that has not been passed yet, that's currently under development. So it's in draft form. Okay, so both of those two, the 2020 social message and the under development social statement, they came out of the 2019 churchwide assembly in Milwaukee. I was there. Was anybody else there at that one? Maybe not? No. And at that assembly, people called for these documents to come about. So a little bit of context. So thinking back to 2019, this is before the pandemic. Donald Trump was elected president, took office in 2017, so he was president. There was a lot of people getting involved in politics because of his presidency who had not been involved in politics before. And there was growing political polarization, which continues to this day, growing disagreement over the role of government should be in society, and growing conflict in families and congregations due to this polarization. So this was really causing problems in a lot of congregations now that more and more people were becoming politically active and really saw it as part of their Christian faith, this political activity. There was also growing mistrust of government. So according to a Pew study, the people who trust the federal government to do what's right all or most of the time fell from 77% in 1964 to 17% in 2019. Yeah, pretty huge difference in just the societal expectations and trust of government. And so this is just such a different context than that 1966 statement we looked at last week, right? And then of course, 2019, we're already looking towards, there's gonna be another election. Churches are gonna care about this and wanna talk about it, and how do we do that in a faithful way? So that's the context. And so the Minneapolis Area Synod brought a memorial. So this is how it works, actually. Any synod can bring a memorial that asks the larger ELCA church body to do something. And if it's passed, then we're supposed to do it as the larger church body. So in this case, the Minneapolis Area Synod brought a memorial to initiate the development of a social statement on the role of government, the nature of civic engagement, and the relationship of church and state. So that was what they asked for in their memorial. Yeah.
The word memorial is being used in
Anybody else can speak to that? I don't know. I mean, I'm just so used to it being used in this way. I don't know why they call it that. Yeah. For the Oregon Synod? Oh, an Earth Care Memorial at maybe for the Oregon Synod, or even for the Synod taking to the ELCA or something. Yeah, I don't know why they call it that. It's kind of like a resolution. Memorandum? Yeah. I don't know why they call it memorials. That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. But it doesn't mean memorial in like a memorial. I mean, it can be maybe like in honor of somebody. Great question. I don't know, but for some reason, this is what we call them this. Okay, and then other people were like, well, if we do a social statement, that'll take a really long time, and it won't be ready before the 2020 election. And so other people on the floor at the assembly were like, actually, I think we need a social message instead. Because we can get one passed in a year, and then we'll have it for pastors trying to figure out, what do I do this election cycle? It can guide us. And so the assembly decided to do both. They decided to institute, the process for both. So we could get one fast, and then we could also get something more extensive. Assemblies are really big. It's like about 1,000 people usually. Yeah. Memory. Oh, did you hear that? Yeah. Okay, remind us to do it. It's a memorial. It's like memory, remembering something. So it's like we're going to remember to do this. Okay, cool. He has a supercomputer in his pocket. What is the Pew Research Institute? Why is it called Pew? I have no idea. No. It doesn't have to do with the church pew. No. It's a famous research institute that's used for a lot of studies. I don't know why it's called that. I don't know. It's an acronym or somebody's name or something. Okay, yeah. Somebody's name maybe. Okay, so this brings us to the social statement, which of course was created more quickly. So this was adopted unanimously. It only needs a 2/3 vote to pass, but it was adopted unanimously by the ELCA Church Council in June of 2020. And it's gathers into one document all the predecessor documents about this topic in the ELCA and predecessor bodies. It offers guidance for thinking about faithful Christian citizenship. Roger Willer is a name that came up several times. I do not know him. I don't know if anybody knows him. You guys know him. Great. He's the director for theological ethics in the office of the presiding bishop in the ELCA. And so he oversees the development of social statements and social messages. So he worked with the team to develop this statement. And once they developed a draft, and that draft went out into all the congregations, more than 500 people, more than 550 individuals offered comments that then were used to revise the draft before it was then presented to the church council and passed. So a lot of people gave input on it. It has 5 main sections, and so some of what is in there is what we've already covered because it's summarizing, previous stuff, including the documents we've already covered in this class. But I wanted to draw out especially the things that I saw in this document that I didn't see in the documents we've covered in detail in this class. The information isn't new. It's still rooted in Lutheran theology. It just didn't come up in the other documents. And so I thought it would be good to mention those. Okay. So Lutherans care about government because it is a gift from God intended for the safety and flourishing of human life. I think it's interesting and maybe telling that they chose this language instead of the more traditional language of government being created and instituted by God. And I wonder if they chose that language because of the same sort of reaction that many of us had when we saw that in a previous document, being like, wait, you're saying the government is instituted by God? That sounds very dangerous, that you're saying this particular leader is, what God wants for the world. And so I'm guessing they chose not to use that language because it is misleading, because it really means that, God wants us to have good government, not necessarily God wants us to have this particular governor. Okay, so they chose that language. Government is intended to do what churches, families, individuals, and businesses cannot do on their own: protect and coordinate the well-being of individuals, communities, and creation. So they're really clarifying that, we as the ELCA believe in having some form of government. We do think this is a social good. It's not an anarchist denomination. For, better, for worse. Okay, so the introduction still, some people object to the church being involved. Here we get into the language, the word politics, which I like that this is in here. Some people object to the church involving itself in matters related to government in politics. So they're addressing that. Taking partisan stances is not the church's role, but politics has to do with negotiating how the benefits and burdens of living in a society are shared. Politics is key to self-governance. I wish that there had been another sentence being like, therefore, churches involving itself in matters related to the government, aka politics, is appropriate, or something like that. But I think it's kind of implied. So we're saying politics doesn't mean what sometimes people mean by it, but it is appropriate in this sense. Civil government at all levels can be a force for good or for evil. So I think that's really helpful to name, that it can be good, it can be evil, or most accurately, both in some combination, which is just so true and really speaks to our simultaneously sinner and saint, that we also have the potential to do good or evil in the world, and the government is made up of us. So this realistic view establishes a fruitful middle ground between idolatrous endorsement of government, we don't want to fall into that, or cynical rejection of having government at all. Yeah.
But it doesn't say
consent of the governed. That is, it doesn't say. It doesn't specify anything about what makes government good. So it will a little bit later give us some criteria for assessing whether government is good or not. So we'll see if that comes up. Okay. So this is where we get into the two kingdoms teaching that had not come up in the other documents, somewhat surprisingly. So they don't call it the two kingdoms teaching in this document. They call it God's right and left hands. And they're talking about handedness. They're not talking about the political right or the political left. Do not be confused. Christian faith teaches that God rules all of creation, and Lutherans see that rule in two distinct ways: the right hand and the left hand of God. So what are those? So the right hand of God is the way God acts in our inner lives. So it instills faith in Jesus Christ. It's the source of faith, the inspiration to do good in the world. It's the way that Christ transforms us through forgiving us and loving us. Christ transforms us, and therefore we're different than we were before, and we want to do good in the world as a response and just as a natural motivation. No one has to force us to do it. It's just we want to. It reminds me of the passage in the Hebrew scriptures about, I will write the law on their hearts. They won't need the law to be outside of themselves being imposed on them. It'll just be what they want to do. They care about other people, and they want to be loving. So they're not going to do evil because they don't want to. It's just inside them. So this is the right hand of God that I sort of think of the way God changes the world or changes me in my life from the inside out. God changes me first, and then how I act in the world changes. And then the left hand of God, that's where the outer social, political, economic world works. And so that's you might think of it as the extrinsic motivation for doing the right thing. Or if you think of parenting, you're trying to instill in your child a care that they actually want to learn, and they actually want to treat other people with respect. But there are times when they don't, And so you also have to create boundaries that like don't let them, or that make them learn even when they don't want to. So it's the sort of the structure, the accountability that comes from outside the self. And so sometimes it's called, with the two kingdoms, the spiritual kingdom and the earthly kingdom. Those also map onto our concept of law and gospel. This is one way of thinking about law and gospel, is that, the gospel transforms us. And like I said before, then we want to do good. The law also kind of, because of the rules that we have as a society, keeps us in line for the sake of everyone. So those rules actually are doing good because they're trying to contribute to the common good. I think of it a little bit like this. Because we're sinful. The left hand will smite you. Yes, exactly. That'd be like the left hand of God, the smiting. Exactly. It'd be like, hey, stay in line. The accountability is the left hand of God. And so this document says that God's two ways of governing are both necessary. So we also need because of sin, we also need outward accountability. And so it says, through God's right hand, we are freed to participate in government and civil society as agents of God's purpose. So God's right hand frees us, and part of our vocation then is to participate in the work of God's left hand, in building a community and the parameters that we all need to keep everybody safe. This document is very concerned with making sure that those two things are connected, the right hand and the left hand. And the two kingdoms theory or doctrine has sometimes been criticized for promoting quietism, like non-action in the political sphere. And because people are like, well, I'm just going to deal with God's kingdom and I'm not going to deal with the earthly kingdom. And people have had trouble making the bridge to why they should care about the earthly kingdom. And so this document really emphasizes how those two ways of governing are connected, and therefore how we are, called and motivated by God to participate in God's left hand, not just to steer only in the right hand type of work. So I'm not going to go into all those themes, but that's one of the things this document really wants to do, is to rescue that right-left hand of God metaphor from its history of being used for political quietism. Okay, then we go on to the next section, governmental roles and functions. Is the neighbor being served? So here we get into the evaluation. So to evaluate how well agencies of government are doing their proper work of providing for the safety and well-being of those within the country's borders and or jurisdiction. I thought it was interesting that phrase was added. Or I don't know if it was added, but that it's in there. The safety and well-being of those within the country's borders and jurisdiction. I didn't like that very much personally, but it is in there consistently. Lutheran asked one simple but all-encompassing question. Is the neighbor being served? So this is our benchmark. This is the ruler. That's the question that we look at when we are measuring how well a government or agency is doing. Is the neighbor being served? And then the document gives us 14 more specific guidelines for assessing the performance of government. And the first one is consent of the governed. And it connects that to our biblical value, our belief that all people are created in the image of God. And therefore, they should have self-determination, that God extends to us self-determination, and we need to extend that to one another. And so that is foundational. Then we have unrestricted participation, public service as vocation, functions and roles for public benefit, equity for public servants. I'm not going to go into all the details of all of those. Neighborly service to strangers, respect and dignity, adequate regulation, reform of government, calling attention to abuses of power, maintaining the distinction between the role and the person filling it. These are a bunch of different things you can look into for how to assess governmental performance according to this. This is the one I did want to add because I think it serves as a counter to that phrase I mentioned before of only serving the people within its own jurisdiction. So here we have recognizing neighbors, not just citizens. Neighbor is a status God bestows on all people. I thought that was cool. I've never thought about it that way before. But neighbor is a status that God bestows on all people. So it doesn't come from the government. The government doesn't get to decide who our neighbor is. God has decided that all people are our neighbor. Official citizenship can be honored and regulated by the law, but it should not be used to strip people of their dignity or their human rights. All residents, asylum seekers, refugees in the U.S. are to be protected as neighbors, even when their status is not decided yet. So that is in there, which I appreciate. Then we have protecting individual freedom and accepting limitations on freedom. And, okay, Lutherans confess that we are complicit. Oh, see, this I thought was pretty strong. We are complicit when we do not participate actively enough in the civic arena to strengthen and support the guidelines for government outlined above. So we have a responsibility to raise our voices. So we can't just be like, well, that has nothing to do with me. Like, I'm not involved in government. I'm not the one who made these rules. It's not my problem or my fault. It's like, actually, they're saying that we as bystanders, and we're more than bystanders, let's be honest, we as participants in this system, we actually are complicit in the evil that is happening. And so we're called to, remember that and to be forgiven for that and to work towards change. It's never going to be a perfect governmental system. So we're always going to have that, complicity. God forgives us and inspires us then to, work on it, to have some responsibility. And this also names that our Lutheran history reveals that we too often are uncritically obedient and subservient to our governments, even authoritarian ones. And that's very true throughout our Lutheran history. There are some examples of resistance that you all are very aware of. But this is an indictment, that's like, this is actually a problem that we have been too uncritical and obedient and just kind of been like, we're just going to deal with the right hand of God. We're not going to do anything with the left. But that is part of our call. And then this section I thought was also really strong. I was inspired by this section, called to civic engagement. So we as Lutherans have learned over time that energetic civic engagement is part of our baptismal vocation, both as individuals and as the church's corporate witness. So we hold to the biblical idea that God calls God's people to be active citizens and to ensure that everyone benefits from the good of government. Well, that was kind of cool. Lutheran civic engagement arises both from a concern about disorder and injustice and from hope about what government can accomplish for the neighbor. So it is God's law and its civic use is intended to contain human sin, and when it fails, everyone is harmed. So I like this idea that it's like we're called to resistance, but also to what some of the theology colleagues in this area call re-existence. There's resistance where you're resisting what is here, and then there's re-existence where you're exerting a different way that is good. And so I hear that here, that we are called to resist disorder, but we also are called to invest in government as a potential good, not just to resist it, but to let it have hope that it can be something good. When government consistently acts against the public good, citizens and other residents need to raise these issues. This includes when there is no lawful recourse, nonviolent civil disobedience. So that got named specifically, as far as I'm aware, for the first time in one of these documents, that nonviolent civil disobedience is within bounds for Lutherans. Civic engagement is a vital aspect. Actually, I should take that back. It's not the first time it's talked about. There's another document that actually goes into descriptions of when it is okay to use civil disobedience. And you see that hinted when there's no lawful recourse here. Yeah.
So during the civil rights movement, there was something like this?
Well, technically the ELCA hadn't been formed yet. So there was that 1966 document, and maybe it did mention civil disobedience. Maybe I should take that back, but I don't remember. I did look at that document. But I do know that there's somewhere else that explains when it's okay to use civil disobedience. Yeah. It's really clarifying, yeah. Yes, this was really helpful. And we had this already. This was in 2020. This came out the summer of 2020, which is when that all was happening. And so it was really valuable to have that stated really directly.
But it's peaceful demonstration, not setting buildings on fire.
Non-violent civil disobedience. You can get into what makes something violent and what makes something not violent, but yes. Direct action, which maybe can be a wider envelope than non-violent. Civic engagement is a vital aspect of discipleship for baptized Christians. I don't think that was really taught to me growing up, that was like a part of being a Christian was civic engagement. I have a lot of typos in this. I apologize. We have a responsibility not only to fulfill our private roles and functions in life, to pray for those in authority, but also to be civically engaged. We do so act against destructive consequences, but also for fair and compassionate governance, like I said before, resisting and re-existing. And someone had emailed me about, what about praying? And that's where, it does come up now and then in these documents that, yes, we should be praying for our political leaders as well. The ELCA is called to discern nonpartisan means of civic engagement. So that's pretty cool. It's like, oh, we have a document that's, in terms of the question, are we supposed to be involved? It's saying that pretty clearly. We're called to a critical prophetic role that has been mentioned. And we should advocate for a more just distribution of both the benefits and burdens of participation in democracy. Conclusion, government is indispensable for safeguarding and improving human life and creation. And then here, I think this is great. Although we may disagree about the best ways to achieve the public good, we do not disagree about our shared responsibility to seek it. Right? Yeah. So any thoughts? Where are we? Oh yeah, great. This is exactly where I wanted to be. Any thoughts or comments on that document before we go on to the one that hasn't even been published yet?
Are they going to have to revise it before it even gets published, considering what's going on?
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second, the one that hasn't been published yet. But any other questions about, or any other thoughts about this one?
I'm still uneasy about the phrase, about the definition of who is our neighbor.
Ooh, okay.
We have to go back to that slide, but about it being the neighbor being within our border. That seems odd to me that they would put that so blatantly.
Oh, I don't think it was. Or what do you mean? Because there was this part that I didn't like, where it was like, oh, this is the part you're talking about. To evaluate how well agencies of government are doing with their proper work of providing for the safety and well-being of those within the country's borders and our jurisdiction. So they're not talking about the neighbor stuff there, but they are saying that maybe people in government just agree with that. I mean, there were people in government who worked on this social statement, just like that is the role of government, is to govern the people in its own jurisdiction. We're not trying to govern the people over there, but right. But I do think it is troubling to me. Mm-hmm.
Dictatorial governments, or you could go around the world, and it's not necessarily that we're supposed to be dominating in those circumstances.
Right.
A voice within all of those situations.
That's such a good point. These really have to do with how are they governing the people in their own jurisdiction. It doesn't have to do with how are they relating to the rest of the world. And it seems like that's a really important missing piece. What were you going to say?
I was just going to comment, this is just a practical acknowledgement of governments have limited powers.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Like they said, here in the United States, we can't pass, well, we can pass laws, but we cannot enforce them as to what Canadians
Right. Right.
they're on the other world.
Yeah.
You might want to do something about that.
Right. Yeah. Like, so there's an aspect of this that's kind of true, that it's like that they're supposed to govern their own people, not the people over there. But it really is overlooking, like, yeah, a big piece. Yeah. We have different levels of government. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So you shouldn't be evaluating them based on something that's not actually their, like, jurisdiction. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm struck by the word here, democracy also, which I think kind of dovetails with Julie's comments. So in the same way that you were saying in 66, 77%, thought the government was doing right and that eroded so much, in the same way, the U.S. was a proponent for democracy throughout
Right.
the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for promoting this kind of governance around the world in a similar sense as been eroded over the years also. And maybe at a low point right now.
I'm really surprised that there's such a gap here. Yeah, this is a huge gap that I'm really surprised was missed in the, or maybe it wasn't missed. Maybe people did raise it in the comments, and those 550 people who commented, but just they decided not to include it or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry, you weren't done. I think what I'm seeing as being missed is that our government does, like, I think the job of our government is to do more than just provide for the safety and well-being of those within its borders. I think the role of our government is also, I don't know how I would phrase it exactly, but to, like, treat, like, when it interacts with other nations and other jurisdictions, that it should treat those with respect and in a way that is fostering the good of both countries, not just fostering the good of our own country. Maybe, yeah.
You have the Defense Department
Right.
defend you, but you also have the State Department.
A State Department, yeah.
These are
Mm-hmm. Right.
supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be influencing and engaging with other countries because we're not.
Jim first, yeah, okay. Yeah. Jim?
Especially from the 20th century on, this country has had a view of the world that has had a deep cleavage right down the middle.
Right.
One is to stand up for supposedly human rights, democracy, et cetera, and universalize that concept.
Right.
That has ebbed and flowed. But we have also had a notion of foreign policy that has been designed to serve American self-interest.
Right.
And that has ebbed and flowed as well. But coming out of World War II, we were the only global power still standing, and we could exercise this for good or ill. So I'm sure they're kind of struggling with this idea of American hegemony globally spread and the dangers of that. We can say we should respect our neighbors, but we have now in the past week have had Justin Trudeau referred to as a governor and Canada the 51st state. Now, that isn't anything but bullying. That's all that is. But it starts to creep into the way we think about this country and the rest of the world, and then you overlay that with some notion of neighbor or neighborhood. could.
And one thing too, in our fight with communism, we would back authoritarian governments if they were anti-communist. I mean, heavily.
They may be an SOB, but there are SOBs.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I wonder if that language is intended to start
Oh, where'd it go?
defining where our influence ends. In other words, we can only tell people that we think they ought to do this, but we can't make them. We can't, because we aren't the biggest,
But I think people
yes.
in those other countries think we are often intruding and telling them how they ought to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and sometimes we are.
Okay, I do need to go to the next thing. Well, you haven't spoken yet, though, so let's hear what you're going to say.
I was just going to say the thing that really struck me was the part where it said nonpartisan civic engagement.
Yes, nonpartisan civic engagement.
A lot of confusion very much kick in.
Right. I think it really does, because it's just saying that it says that what appropriate engagement for the church is nonpartisan engagement. And so then it's like, what makes something partisan? It's like we seem pretty clear that like endorsing a particular candidate or a particular political party is partisan. But what happens when it's just like a policy, or what happens when it's an issue that the two parties really strongly disagree on, and we're taking a stance on that issue, and then it's kind of like, well, we're kind of siding with one of the two parties. So now does that make it partisan? And it's like, well, it's not our fault that the two parties disagree about an issue that is like pertinent to the good of humanity. Like, are we not allowed to talk about it because they're talking about it? Yeah, that's one of my questions about what makes something partisan. Okay, let's go on, because this next, I'm really, really excited about this draft social statement. I was reading it last night and was like, I'm actually really impressed. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens at the church-wide assembly where this will be voted on. So let's take a look. So Roger Willer, same guy, also oversees the process for the social statements. But this involves an 18-person task force. There were more than 80 nominees to serve on this task force. And so all those people, had to submit information about themselves and why they would, be the right fit for this task force. And 18 were selected. It is a bipartisan task force. It's ethnically diverse. It has clergy, lay people, people from urban and rural areas, attorneys, theologians, military folks, and government folks. So it is supposed to be as representative of the ELCA as we can do in a task force. That's the aspiration. So here's their timeline. The task force was seated by the ELCA Church Council in June of 2020. So this is the same time that the social message was passed. So they also decided, here are the people who are going to make the task force for the next one, the social statement. The social message was passed, and then the task force for the statement was seated. They began their meetings in 2020, and they had an intensive listening series. So they spent a long time doing intensive study, but then also doing listening events to get input from people before even drafting anything. Then they worked on a draft. It says they published a study based on those initial listening events. I haven't seen that, but they published something about here's what we've been finding so far. And then they wrote a draft statement, and that was published, and the response period began. And that response period lasted for the good chunk of 2024. It just closed September 30th. I was a little sad to see that, because we could have participated if my class had been during that window. We could have taken this class, and then we could have all submitted comments. So it's too late for that, unfortunately. Also, during this period, if you've ever been to a synod assembly, which is the Oregon version of the big church-wide assembly, they have like little workshop breakout areas during certain times, and they talk about the different social statements, and people are able to give comments in that public forum, and then those comments are captured and also submitted to the task force for consideration. So that's another way that comments are captured, is through those live events at Synod assemblies. So that ended the end of September, and so they are currently revising the statement based on all the input that they have received. And so they are scheduled to post the proposed statement in 2025 in February, and then the church council is supposed to look at it and hopefully decide to recommend it. And then this coming summer, churchwide assembly I think it's in Phoenix this year, we will hopefully have the opportunity to vote. Phoenix in August, doesn't that sound fun? Yeah. Yeah. So that is the life cycle of the creation of this. Yes.
In 2025, April, when they consider it, is that when amendments could be attached to it that might?
I believe so. So in April 2025, when the church council looks at it, I believe they would have the opportunity to recommend it with amendments. And then when the churchwide assembly meets in July and August, they also can make amendments. So on the floor, people can stand up and be like, I'd like to amend this section to say this. And then there's someone frantically trying to type that up on the screen in front of 1,000 people. It's not a fun job for that person. So yeah, actually on the floor with the 1,000 people, the amendments can be made as well. So you can, as you can imagine, sometimes that can be really long and tedious and confusing. And then somebody amends the amendment and it gets very complicated. But yes, there will still be time for amendments. So what I'm showing you today is not, this is the draft they published a year ago, and now they're revising it. So we have not seen anything more recent than this, but it's not going to be exactly this. Okay. So this is the outline that they have. It has 6 sections. And many of our social statements more recently have come in like a small catechism, large catechism type format because they're getting long. The social statement from 1991, I don't remember how many pages it was, but it was like about the same length as the short statement. So the full statement is 40 pages, but then they also have the short version, which has the same sections and covers the topics just more succinctly. Okay, so I did print out the short statement. If anybody would like to take it home, I will give it to you at the end. So if you'd like to take it home and look at it, I have the 8-page short statement. Okay, so let's take a look. Like I said, I'm going to try to lift up the things that weren't in previous documents mostly, or things that I thought were just stated more clearly in this document. I really liked it. I thought it spoke to the issue really clearly. It starts with shalom, which I thought was cool. So it goes back to the Hebrew concept of shalom in our Hebrew scriptures, saying that God's power and love seeks shalom, the fullness of peace, well-being, goodness, truth, beauty, justice, freedom, wholesomeness, and love woven together for all. So this is what we're looking for. And often I use the, kingdom of God. We're building the kingdom of God. But another thing would be we're trying to live into shalom. It would be the same sort of idea. This I thought was interesting. It talks about how God's sovereignty grants creatures, all of us, our power. And then God intends that we share the gift of power so that human structures and systems serve the intended well-being of all with good order and justice. As a community organizer, I love that they're talking directly about power here. So they're talking about shared power rather than power over, which is what we talk about in community organizing, power among or power with, as opposed to power over. So it's talking about the gift of power, because God has power and God gives us power. Yes?
Does it include non-human creatures?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
We look at that word creature as opposed to people.
Yes, it doesn't say people, it says creatures, so they're included. Yep. So we all have some power in this world. And so we need to be using that power for the good of all. Human beings are inherently social creatures and necessarily political beings. I thought that was cool that was in the social statement. So we are intended to use our knowledge, wisdom, and power, again, power, to foster the common good. So when that is done, we are fulfilling our God-given human vocation to use our knowledge, wisdom, and power to affect the common good. And we're joining in God's activity of the world, God's left-hand activity in the world. Here we get the left-hand, right-hand thing again, framed as law and gospel this time. Law, God's directives. The left hand, the external, you must do this, you should, you shall not. And then the gospel, God's right hand. This can be thought of as two strategies working together for the single goal of well-being for all. And I really thought it was neat that this is included. This document has a lot more about like pluralism in it than any of the previous documents that we have studied. To walk humbly with God must include welcoming and acknowledging the ideas, values, and contributions of all people, regardless of their religious tradition or worldview. Isn't that cool? I love that reading of Micah 6:8. Is that the... Yep, that's the end of that section. So that's the first section, okay? And the second section, this also has, I think, something about pluralism in it too. Let's see if we get to it. So participation in civic organizations comes in many shapes and sizes. There's been a decline in civic participation in the U.S., and I think that's also somewhat generational. I think it's across, as far as I'm aware, it's across all generations, but younger generations are even less involved in civic institutions than previous generations. They've lost trust in civic institutions, kind of like the trust in government. Our church affirms that anyone who seeks community's well-being through civic participation is, knowingly or not, using the gifts God provides. They are acting as channels of God's concern for human life. So it's like validating this idea that we can see God at work in the world, even in people who are not Christian. That's still like the force for good in the world that we call God, that we can recognize in our siblings who are not Christian. So I thought that was an interesting little bit of like pluralistic theology coming in. Christian worshiping assemblies. Okay, this I thought was new, because what I had noticed in some of the previous documents was that there was a lot of talk about how we as individuals live out our baptismal callings to be engaged civically. And then there was a lot of talk about the ELCA as a denomination using its power to advocate for our values. But it didn't really say much specifically about congregations. And I felt like that would have been helpful to really clarify that, yes, congregations are supposed to do it too. And then we finally get that in this document. Worshiping assemblies are grounded in law and gospel, and it empowers us to be centers supporting civic participation. The idea that churches can be centers supporting civic participation. This is evident in how liturgy prepares us to join God's work in civic life. I don't know if everyone would find that evident in liturgy, but I mean, that is part of at least what we're trained on in seminary. The liturgy is about, motivating and inspiring us to go out and act in the world, including in our civic life. So good liturgy, anyway, is empowering us to be involved in the civic life. As expressed in the Constitution, which I didn't think was that clearly expressed, but as expressed in the ELCA Constitution and social teaching, this church expects that each worshiping community will be engaged in forms of active civic participation as one element of life in Christ's church. So not only now is it that it's okay for you to do it, it's like that's part of what your job is as a church, is you should be doing this, which I was like, wow, okay. That's pretty strong, I thought. That's the strongest I've seen so far. This is great also. Like I said, I'm really impressed by this statement. Religion can create divisions in civic life. So that can sometimes be an argument for not doing it. Or it can contribute to the mending of the torn social fabric. This church urges people of faith to seek a constructive role, so to use religion for good in public life in a way that counters polarization and distrust and ill will. And that we have particular gifts of moral vision and practicing inclusion and compassion that our civic life needs and is really lacking right now. And so we actually need to be bringing the gifts of our tradition, and not bringing our tradition in a way that's going to further divide people. Yeah. Yeah, are other churches exploring this statement? Yes. Oh, sorry. This is just an ELCA thing. I thought you meant other congregations. Okay. Are other denominations having similar conversations? I believe so. I'm not super familiar with like the, social teaching, like how it's documented or created in other denominations, but definitely it's not just us talking about it, for sure. So the ELCA and other religious bodies, we have a calling to encourage discernment and provide spaces for difficult conversations, so that this is like, instead of like, don't talk about it at church, this is actually where we should practice talking about it. And I loved this sentence. Discussion about tough issues among God's people is a witness that counters the forces of social division and distrust. That actually we're called to have the hard conversations and like show that it can be done, that we can continue to listen to one another with compassion even when we disagree, that like our ability to talk about tough issues openly with respect towards one another is a witness to Christ's love and as a witness to shalom and God's kingdom. I thought that kind of blew me away, actually. I had not really thought of it that way before, especially right now when we just don't really see, I don't really see models of people having healthy political conversation very often. And the way that like the church could model that for society, that's really powerful, I think. The LCA encourages individuals and worshiping communities to work together toward a civic life that better reflects God's vision, blah, blah, blah. Flowing from trust built through one-to-one relationships. Oh, I was like, why did I put this in here? Because it's talking about organizing. Flowing from trust built through one-to-one relationships. Yay, one-on-ones. Faith-based organizing seeks to spur action by building coalition of like-minded people in most local contexts. Faith-informed advocacy of various kinds can play a transformative role in a polarized political world by bringing people together to work toward the common good in public life. So it's saying that worshiping communities, here again, not just individuals, but your worshiping community can work together towards changing your civic life around you through some of these ways. And one of the ways that it's included is community organizing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I find it striking that there's continued reference to the common good. Because there are political philosophies that deny such an existence of a common good, that we are only individuals, and there are only individual winners and losers, and there is no common good.
Yeah. So it's like taking on a particular stance, or a particular viewpoint, just by framing it this way. That's what you're pointing out. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
So I just make a quick comment on Nikki's comment.
Mm-hmm.
There may be other denominations that are thinking about these things, but unfortunately there are others that are going through fissures over the role of women and LGBTQ.
Of course.
Where, as opposed to thinking about how to do these things, they're thinking about splitting off, right? Because they don't want everyone to have these rights.
Right.
It would be nice to think that all Methodist, Episcopalians, all could come together and
Work on it together.
go out and say, okay, enough is enough.
Right. Let's speak with a common voice, these ecumenical partners. That'd be amazing.
And even beyond that, to other traditions, other
Right.
religions, the same way. Because at the heart of most of the world religions, this is what is valued, the common good.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there were some cool things in this about the using that word political in politics and Jesus. Was Jesus political? They actually take that on. The scriptures are clear that he was not political in the sense of affiliation with a particular political party, a partisan movement, or a designer of civic legislation. However, the Bible biblical claim that Jesus is Lord is a political statement as well as a religious one. And Jesus called government leadership to accountability to such an extent that he was executed as a political criminal. Today, concern for the neighbor and the common good means the church is called to follow Jesus' example by engaging appropriate issues with care that are in the political arena. So, yes, engage, and with care and thoughtfulness. Political partisanship is not proper for the church. I thought that was a funny phrasing. Even while we engage in issues that have political elements. Yeah, speaks to me about, the whole Jesus is saying everyone should be fed, we should feed our neighbors. And it's if that is a political or partisan issue, that doesn't mean it's not a Christian issue. There are issues that have political elements that are still Christian issues. Civic participation involves matters of government and political life. Politics is often used today to express disgust with dishonest practices, partisan shenanigans, power grabs, ploys of deceit, and the sinful use of authority. They better not drop that partisan shenanigans part because it's delightful. Politics in this statement, however, is understood as the negotiation of how the benefits, burdens, rights, and responsibilities of living in a society are shared. So now we have the second sentence. Well, kind of. Politics rightly understood and practiced then is essential to civic well-being and of concern to God's people. So that sentence that I was missing before, which was therefore, yes, you need to deal with politics as the church. Yeah.
With one more word.
Yeah.
Include oligarchs.
Oligarchs. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so they did kind of the same thing, dealing with the word politics and the idea that we shouldn't deal with politics. And it's clarifying, well, if politic means a lot of the negative connotations of politics, then no, we don't want to behave like that. But if politics means community and society and how we are, treating and holding one another accountable to the values of this society, then yes, that is of concern to God's people and is, something that has to do with the well-being of all, which is what we're about. So then we get into assessing governments again. So this is a similar thing that we had in the previous statement. So, but do you remember the question from the previous statement? What was the norm that we were supposed to be asking? Is the neighbor being served? Nice. Is the neighbor being served was the question from the previous statement. They don't use the exact same question here. Here they say, how faithful is it to God's purposes of well-being, including caring for the most vulnerable members of the community? Is the neighbor being served is a little easier to remember, a little bit more catchy, right? Yeah, I don't know why they chose to say it differently, but they are really lifting up a particular care of the most vulnerable, that there's a weightedness that we don't just think about the care of neighbor equally, but that we actually give special thought and attention to the neighbors who are the most vulnerable. God's preferential option for the poor in liberation theology, that's what that's called, that there's actually a special concern for a particular group, the most vulnerable. God's preferential option for the poor. It basically means that God is not impartial. God is on the side of the poor, not on the side of the rich. Yeah. And so this is really, I think, emphasizing that the neighbor, the rich are our neighbor also, but in terms of whose side are we on, that chant, we are on the side of the poor as Christians. God's power sustains and gives power to creation. Again, that whole power thing, I think is really cool theology in here. So the criterion for government and political authority is whether it increases the power of those that it serves. Because it's saying God gives power to creation, so a good government should be giving power to its people, which I thought was really cool. I'd never heard it stated that way before. The most radical feature of the Constitution is the first three words, we the people. We talked about that before, that separation of church and state is really about taking the power away, you're claiming power not because it's God. You're not using religious authority to claim your power. We're actually just saying the people are the ones who give the authority. And so the people are sovereign. The ratification of the Constitution itself enacts a preference for self-determination, that the people get to govern themselves. And no, in a minute we'll get to it. Government action can be evaluated by how well it grants power to those subject to it. And this I thought was great, that it just comes out and says it. The United States is not a Christian nation. It was not founded on specifically Christian principles, though Christians and Christianity did influence its ethos. The premise of the Constitution and its ratification is that the sovereign is we the people, not we the Christians. I thought that was really great. And then it gets into what we already talked about with what does separation of church and state really mean, and what does the First Amendment, is that putting restrictions on us and our civic engagement as a church? And it addresses that. It says the free exercise of religion means that religious people may enter public debate and decision-making with their religious convictions. That's part of the free exercise of religion. The First Amendment does not prohibit or discourage the application of religious convictions to public life. It makes an interesting point that I hadn't thought about. If non-establishment, so not establishing a religion of the state, if that meant that religious commitments couldn't enter public life, then religious people would be uniquely harmed. It'd be discrimination on the basis of religion. That we would be the only people not allowed to bring our highest commitments to bear on public questions. Well, that was an interesting twist. The LCA holds that the constructive relationship, we know this one, of political authority is institutional separation of religious organizations and institutions in a relation of functional interaction. So it brings that up again from our Constitution. Christ's church should not bless any particular political theory. No political system or theory is final or ultimate. But of course, we've already pointed out that even just the way they're framing this is viewed through a particular lens, like there's a certain theory that is, how they're looking at everything. And so we can never really get out. It's really hard to get out of your own glasses. And then it talks about pastors specifically. I think probably a lot of pastors felt the need to have some, discussion of the challenge. Yes, thank you. And rostered ministers. It talks about rostered ministers specifically, not pastors specifically. Good point. So rostered ministers specifically who are saying like, this can be really challenging. We can be like, our congregations can get mad at us if we're publicly active, or wherever a deacon is serving might be in trouble for this. So rostered ministers face particular issues regarding the relationship of church and political authority because of their divine office to preach and teach both law and gospel. Rostered ministers also are public figures because they lead public institutions and have a valuable role to play. So when they speak on public issues, their words should be rooted in scriptures and are to be governed by official ELCA teaching. Though there necessarily is a public face to the rostered role, this does not justify partisanship, such as telling members how to vote. Okay. Yeah, this is tricky. And I wonder, I don't know. It's tricky because then how are like deacons and pastors supposed to like live out their own, like I think of Facebook, kind of a public forum, but it's also your personal Facebook page. Like these things get kind of tricky. But anyway, that's what it says.
It's hard for us to think if you're an individual, but you're also
The pastor, right. To separate that out. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So is telling somebody how to vote different than saying, this is how I vote?
I don't know. In phrasing, no. I mean, in phrasing, yes, it's different. Yeah, in phrasing, those are not the same thing.
Or could you say, I voted for
Right.
love, I voted for, compassion,
Right.
diversity. I mean, you could say, I voted for things that weren't an individual.
Right. I was also wondering, like it says how to vote. And I'm like, I know I'm not supposed to tell people how to vote in terms of people, like which candidates to vote for. But what if like we have as a congregation are like, working on some project and trying to get something like passed, like some sort of, what would those be called? Like a resolution or something at the county level or the, and like part of that work is like encouraging people to vote and to vote for our thing, So I'm like, does this preclude us from doing that? Like, I don't know. I thought I should put it in there because I thought it was important.
Those kind of things are not necessarily partisan.
Right. But it doesn't say that. It just says how to vote. But it does say partisanship. So, yeah. So partisan voting, I guess. I don't know. Okay, we have like 3 more slides. Sorry for going over time. Here we got Christian nationalism, foreshadowing for our class in 2025. The LCA understanding of civic life and faith is at odds with Christian nationalism because the latter seeks to fuse the exercise of political authority with a selected set of supposed Christian ideals. It also asserts that Christianity should be a privileged religion in the United States. So we're saying not Christian nationalism, and that is laid out clearly here.
What do they mean by privilege?
A privileged religion in the United States. Yeah, I guess so.
Preferred.
Yeah. I'm not sure.
And that the laws follow the beliefs of that.
Yeah, the laws follow the beliefs of that religion. Mm-hmm.
So if you're Muslim, you're not
Privilege, that's right.
Not privileged, for sure. Mm-hmm. If you're Christian, yeah, Christian nationalism. I'm guessing we're going to learn quite a bit more about Christian nationalism in an upcoming class. So I'm looking forward to that. Okay, the last section is, it has this section of contemporary concerns where they kind of just, it says like the articles that follow are contemporary issues, and this is not intended to be comprehensive. And these are issues that have not been taken up in other social statements already by the ELCA. So it has this list of like positions that it takes on a couple, like what sort of seems like a bunch of random issues. I mean, they're all like issues that matter, but it's just interesting that it's like this document actually takes a bunch of positions, kind of just sort of like a miscellaneous, these are positions that haven't been taken elsewhere yet that we want to be clear that we are taking as an ELCA. And so I'm not going to go into all of those, but these are the topics, or some of the topics in that list. Hyperpartisan polarization in our country, misleading and inflammatory discourse, distinguishing between fact and misinformation. You can see these are all very timely. The responsibility of social media platforms. There's a statement about what we think the government and social media platforms should do. Limits on financial contributions to political campaigns. The problematic relationship between the U.S. and its non-incorporated territories. The sovereignty of tribal nations. Comprehensive civics education. Robust civics participation. So those are the majority of the topics that are taken up just briefly in this document, in this section. So, pick up a copy, and unfortunately you'll probably be disappointed because it gives you a paragraph on each one. So you really then need to go online and read the long version to really get the details. But if you're curious, pick up a topic. And then it concludes with your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that is not just a prayer, it is very much our prayer, but it is also our vocation. That we participate in the left hand of God through participating in civic life for the well-being of all. Okay, yeah.
Could I just make a plug for this?
Please, yes.
In January and early February, during the season of Epiphany, I'm going to be teaching a class that will deal with many of these issues. I've entitled it Christian Extremism, the Heresy and Its Consequences. And I will explain my use of heresy. Academics tend not to use that term too often. Here's part of the description. How do we untie the Gordian knot regarding the relationship between extremist religion and national politics? We might state the problem this way. Religion and politics should remain separate because they have the potential to corrupt each other. Religion and politics cannot remain separate because people's fundamental values will and ought to inform the social and political order. But what happens when extremist religion, right-wing Christianity in this case, and extremist politics, extremist right-wing American politics in this case, join hands? And we will be dealing with Tim Alberta's very significant book entitled The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. So I invite you all to come beginning on January 5th.
And it looks like you have some handouts.
Well, not for now.
Not for now, it's for later. Okay.
Carol's got these ready for me.
I see. Okay. Okay, well, I have some handouts. I have the short version of the social statement, the one that is the draft. And then I have like 20 copies of that, and then just, I think, a couple copies of the article I had passed out on the first week if anybody still didn't get that. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you get some things to talk about and think about.